What if I told you the biggest threat of the 2026 Formula One era isn't a car? It's a decision Mercedes already made. Because deep inside the paddock, rivals aren't worried about being slower. They're worried about something worse. Not being able to afford the fight at all. There are internal reports suggesting Mercedes' 2026 power unit could force teams into spending choices that break long-term projects, reshape alliances, and quietly decide championships before the first lap in Melbourne. And here's the part almost no one is talking about. The real story isn't the engine itself. It's what the FIA may have to do once the consequences become impossible to ignore. Officially, nothing is wrong. That's the line coming out of the FIA, and it's the line every team is publicly repeating. The regulations are clear. The cost cap is fixed. The power unit framework has been signed off years in advance. From the outside, 2026 looks controlled, predictable, almost sanitized. But insiders will tell you that when Formula One sounds this calm, it usually means the real conversation is happening somewhere else. And right now, that conversation keeps circling back to Mercedes. Not because they're winning. Not because they're complaining. But because they went quiet far earlier than expected. Mercedes didn't arrive at this point accidentally. Long before fans accepted that the team was stuck in a post-dominant slump, decisions were already being made behind closed doors. Not upgrades cancelled at the factory. Not development stalled on track. But a deeper, more uncomfortable choice. Which future mattered more? The present, where points and podiums still carried political weight. Or 2026, where the rules would reset everything and mistakes would be frozen for years. Most teams hesitated. Mercedes didn't. And that hesitation gap is where the first unanswered questions begin. Publicly, Toto Wolff has framed the last seasons as learning years. Necessary pain. A recalibration period after ground effect exposed weaknesses the team never expected. That explanation is tidy. It's also incomplete. Because what isn't explained is why Mercedes accepted those losses so early, and so cleanly, without the desperation updates we saw from rivals. No panic. No radical mid-season resets. Just a steady message that the future mattered more than the headlines. That kind of discipline only happens when something else is already in motion. Inside the paddock, engineers from other teams began noticing the shift before fans did. Mercedes engineers stopped asking certain questions. They stopped chasing marginal gains in areas that were about to be reset anyway. They started asking different questions instead. Questions about integration. About manufacturing limits. About thermal behavior under conditions the regulations barely reference. None of that shows up on timing screens. But all of it points to a project that isn't built to react. It's built to define the problem everyone else has to solve. This is where the tone quietly changes. Because when teams talk about Mercedes and 2026, the language isn't admiration. It's concern. Not because Mercedes has broken the rules, but because they may have taken the rules more literally than anyone else was willing to. And Formula One history is full of moments where that distinction mattered more than outright speed. What looks equal on paper rarely stays equal once engineers start exploiting what the paper doesn't forbid. The FIA, for now, projects confidence. They insist the framework works. That convergence is possible. That no manufacturer holds a structural advantage. But the same officials privately admit something else. Once a design philosophy is locked in under a cost cap, correcting course becomes painfully slow. And if one manufacturer commits earlier, harder, and more expensively, the gap isn't measured in tenths. It's measured in years. That's why scrutiny around Mercedes isn't loud yet. It's cautious. Because no one wants to open a door they can't close again. And this is why the story can't be reduced to a single engine or a single innovation. The real issue is momentum. Mercedes didn't just start early. They forced everyone else to realize, far too late, that waiting was a luxury. And the question that's now spreading through technical departments isn't whether Mercedes is fast. It's whether matching them requires a level of commitment that some teams simply cannot survive. That answer isn't coming yet. But every move from here on makes it harder to turn back. What makes this phase different is that the anxiety isn't coming from performance charts. It's coming from spreadsheets. Inside rival factories, the 2026 Mercedes project is being discussed less by aerodynamicists and more by financial controllers. Because the whispers coming out of Brixworth suggest a power unit philosophy that doesn't just demand innovation. It demands commitment at a level that quietly bends the cost cap to its absolute edge. And once a team commits to that path, there's no graceful exit. You either follow it all the way through, or you accept that you'll be chasing shadows for seasons. Engineers familiar with the early Mercedes concepts describe something unsettling. Not a single breakthrough component, but an ecosystem. Materials chosen not just for performance, but for how they behave after hundreds of heat cycles. Manufacturing tolerances that only make sense if you're confident the design won't change for years. Development paths that assume regulatory stability, not intervention. This isn't how teams usually behave under a cost cap. It's how they behave when they believe the rulebook has already been fully explored. And that belief is what's sending warning signals through the paddock. Because copying this kind of solution isn't like copying a wing. You don't just redesign and move on. You retool production. You lock suppliers. You burn budget before you even know if the concept survives a season. For manufacturer teams, that's painful. For independents, it's existential. And that's why some teams are quietly hoping the FIA steps in, not to penalize Mercedes, but to protect the grid from an arms race that only a few can afford to finish. The irony is that Mercedes hasn't forced anyone's hand publicly. There's no protest campaign. No political pressure. No media narrative. Just silence. And in Formula One, silence from a team like Mercedes is rarely passive. It usually means they're waiting for others to reveal their position first. Waiting to see who blinks. Because once rivals commit resources to chasing the wrong interpretation, Mercedes' advantage becomes self-reinforcing. This is also why comparisons to 2014 keep resurfacing, even if everyone pretends they're irrelevant. Back then, the advantage wasn't just power. It was confidence. Mercedes knew early that their solution worked. Everyone else spent years trying to catch up, unsure whether they were even chasing the right target. What worries teams now is that the same pattern may already be forming, only under tighter financial constraints and harsher consequences for getting it wrong. There's another layer that rarely gets discussed publicly. The customer teams. Mercedes doesn't just race its own cars. It supplies others. That means any extreme design choice has ripple effects. Data flows faster. Problems surface earlier. But it also means the benchmark spreads. If customer teams perform well, it validates the power unit. If they don't, it exposes integration limits. Either outcome accelerates Mercedes' learning curve, and learning quickly is the most expensive advantage of all. And this is where the unease becomes something closer to inevitability. Because once testing begins, teams won't just be judging lap times. They'll be judging trajectories. Who looks adaptable? Who looks locked in? Who looks like they've already accepted the cost of doing business in the new era? And who looks like they're already rationing updates? That's when the real gap begins to form. Not in seconds, but in decisions that can't be undone once the season is underway. What hasn't fully surfaced yet is how exposed everyone becomes once the cars actually run. Before testing, theory protects reputations. After testing, reality starts asking uncomfortable questions. And insiders expect that the first real signal won't come from outright lap time. It will come from how hard teams are pushing on day one. Who is running conservative programs? Who is already stretching reliability? And who looks like they've designed an engine that needs to be used aggressively just to justify its cost? Mercedes, according to people close to the project, is preparing for a scenario where restraint isn't an option. The power unit philosophy they've chosen only pays off when it's fully exploited. That means high thermal loads, tight operating windows, little margin for improvisation. It's a design that assumes confidence. But confidence in Formula One is expensive, because it forces you to accept risk early, when there's no guarantee the rest of the grid won't respond. Rivals see this and face a dilemma that isn't technical. It's strategic. Do you chase a concept that may already be out of reach, knowing it will consume budget and development tokens for years? Or do you accept a smaller ceiling in exchange for stability and survivability? Under a cost cap, that decision defines your identity. And Mercedes has effectively forced that decision sooner than anyone expected. What makes this particularly volatile is timing. The 2026 calendar starts fast. Flyaway races. Limited upgrade windows. No breathing room to regroup. If you arrive with the wrong philosophy, you don't get a quiet reset. You get exposed in front of the entire paddock. That's why some teams are already planning their narrative for when things don't align. Because once the season starts, explanations become as important as results. There's also a political undercurrent that's impossible to ignore. If Mercedes' approach proves successful, pressure on the FIA will intensify immediately. Not to punish Mercedes, but to prevent escalation. Yet changing regulations mid-cycle undermines credibility. Doing nothing risks entrenching advantage. It's a scenario regulators hate. And teams know it. Which is why the lobbying hasn't started yet. Everyone is waiting for proof. This waiting period is exactly where Mercedes thrives. They don't need confirmation. They already committed. Every month that passes without intervention makes reversal harder. Every supplier contract locked in increases inertia. And inertia under a cost cap is power. By the time the debate becomes public, the window to equalize may already be gone. And this leads to the question no one is willing to answer out loud. What if the 2026 era isn't defined by speed at all? What if it's defined by who could afford to be wrong the least? Mercedes has already placed its bet. Others are still deciding whether they can afford to sit at the table. And that hesitation may end up costing more than any technical mistake ever could. As the focus shifts closer to the competitive consequences, another layer of tension begins to surface inside Mercedes itself. This project is not universally comfortable, even within the team. When you commit this early and this aggressively, internal tolerance for error disappears. Every subsystem becomes non-negotiable. Every delay has cascading effects. People familiar with the program describe an atmosphere that feels less like development and more like execution under pressure. Not because expectations are public, but because the internal benchmark has already been set far higher than anyone is willing to admit externally. The power unit, in this context, isn't just an engine. It's a reference point that dictates how everything else behaves. Cooling architecture, packaging philosophy, aerodynamic trade-offs. Once those decisions are locked, the car stops being flexible. And flexibility is usually how teams survive regulation changes. Mercedes appears to have sacrificed some of that adaptability in exchange for a sharper peak. That's a gamble. A calculated one. But still a gamble. What complicates matters further is that success would come with its own kind of instability. If Mercedes arrives strong, the political environment around the team changes instantly. Customer relationships become strained. Alliances get reassessed. Because a dominant power unit doesn't just lift one team. It reshapes the competitive order across multiple garages. That kind of influence attracts scrutiny, even when everything is legal. And Mercedes has lived through that before. There's also a psychological element rivals are watching closely. Confidence is contagious. So is doubt. If Mercedes looks composed in early races, rivals won't just see speed. They'll see confirmation. Confirmation that the money was well spent. That the pain of previous seasons wasn't wasted. And once that belief takes hold, development paths across the grid start to converge or collapse accordingly. Some teams push harder. Others quietly pivot to damage control. Inside rival factories, planning meetings now include scenarios that were never supposed to exist under the cost cap. What if the performance gap is real but unreachable? What if catching up takes longer than a regulation cycle? What if the smartest move isn't to chase Mercedes at all, but to survive until the next reset? Those are not conversations teams like having. They signal acceptance rather than ambition. And they only happen when the perceived cost of fighting becomes too high. This is why the early races of 2026 may feel strangely tense even if the championship picture isn't clear yet. Every retirement, every reliability issue, every conservative strategy call will be interpreted as evidence. Not just of performance, but of confidence. Observers will start asking which teams are protecting their assets and which are spending them. Because under these regulations, spending confidence early often determines who controls the narrative later. And this brings the story back to its most unresolved point. Mercedes didn't just build a fast power unit. They built a situation. One where every other team must reveal how much risk they're willing to absorb. And once those choices are made visible, they can't be hidden again. The 2026 season may start with lap times and headlines. But beneath that surface, the real contest will already be underway.